Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to what promises to be a fantastic evening of reminiscing and reflections with our friends Richard and Joe. Before we move on to introductions for Richard and Joe, I'd like to introduce Heidi Kenny. Heidi is joining us as a trustee emeritus and a member of the class of 1976. She's currently also a co-chair for her reunion class this year. So thank you, Heidi, for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you. And good evening, and thank you all for joining us. This year marks the 50th anniversary of women at Providence College. On September 13th, 1971, 212 women enrolled as PC's first four-year class. To celebrate this milestone, Providence College will have a year-long celebration that will kick off at the end of this summer and will run through June of 2022. The alumni magazine you recently received was created to promote the awareness of this special year in PC's history. If you haven't had an opportunity to see it, I really definitely say it's worth reading. It's a terrific issue. Dr. Richard Grace, class of 1962, 2017 honoree, and professor emeritus of history, joins us tonight as one of Providence College's most celebrated historian. Dr. Grace arrived at PC in 1958 as a student in the year-old liberal arts honors program. And except for 3 years studying for a PhD at Fordham University, he has been at the college ever since. He was hired to teach history in 1965 by college president Reverend Vincent C. Dorr, OP, class of 1923, and has served under 6 of PC's 13 presidents. Dr. Grace directed the honors program from 1970 to 1987 and chaired the history department from 1994 to 2000. Since his retirement in 2014, Dr. Grace has continued to teach a seminar in histories to honor students. In 2017, during the celebration of PC Centennial, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humanities degrees. His 3 children are also alumni from the classes of 2002, 2005, and 2009. Tonight, Dr. Grace will share his reflections about a critical time in PC's history and engage you all in a lively conversation about all things PC. Joe Carr, class of 1983, has been Associate Vice President of the Division of Marketing and Communications at PC since 2011. A political science major at the college, he also holds a master's degree in mass communication from Emerson College. Prior to his return to Providence, Joe was Director of University Relations at the University of Maine, his home state. He has also worked as a broadcast journalist in television and radio, a career that he began right here at Providence with WDOM. Joe's wife, Ellen, is also an alumnus from the class of 1983. I'll now turn it over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Heidi, and thanks for all that you do for our alma mater and a special greetings as your class celebrates its 45th reunion this weekend. We're looking forward to having about 900 or so visitors on campus to celebrate a bunch of reunion classes as we catch up on a few and make some turns toward a more normal configuration, but it's pretty exciting to have a big in-person event coming up in just a couple of days. And thank you all for being with us tonight. This is a sort of a reprise of what we did last year, and it was an awful lot of fun because we all had the opportunity to tap into the wit and wisdom of Providence College's muse and scribe, Richard Grace. Like many of you, I would characterize Richard as one of my, if not my very favorite professors when I was a PC student, and it's an unbelievable legacy that, as Heidi indicated, dates back to 1958. But Richard, it occurs to me, there's not much time between 1958 and 1971. You were a young faculty member in 1971. What were you doing then, and what do you kind of remember about your day to day?
I had just become director of the honors program in 1970, so that was sort of an all-consuming job at that point in time. But I've been prowling through back issues of the Cowl over the course of the last week, and I'm surprised how many committees I was on that I've forgotten about.
Now, things don't change much, I guess, then. We'll look at it that way, right, over time. But obviously, a momentous year, and to kind of set the stage, I think that it's sometimes useful to think in terms of popular culture and to reflect on the year 1971. Sorry, what I thought I was going to do isn't working quite as I hoped it would there, as often is the case. There we go.
Okay.
Let's look at some of the things that were going on in the world and reconsider, and in some ways they certainly do need to be reconsidered, the top 5 songs of 1971. That's not the Christmas hymn. That's Jeremiah Was a Bullfrog. Remember that one? So Rod Stewart, Carole King, the Osmonds. So not only Donnie, but Marie too, apparently. And the Bee Gees were getting going in I guess we would call this the beginning of the post-Beatles era. John Lennon and Paul McCartney both had their own successes as solo artists during that time frame too. So pretty good, I guess. Richard, what do you think when you look at that list?
I'm trying to remember all the songs, actually. I think I can remember most of them.
Yeah. The longer list includes Knock 3 Times, Tony Orlando and Dawn, so it gets worse from here. But anyway, the good old days. The top 5 movies of the year: Fiddler on the Roof, Billy Jack, The French Connection, certainly a classic, starring Gene Hackman, Summer of 42, and a Bond movie, James Bond, Diamonds Are Forever. I can't say that I remember Fiddler on the Roof being a movie, but nevertheless, apparently it was, and there it is. So very good. I should acknowledge I was 10 years old, turned 10 years old.
Okay.
So, and
You
television.
should have been prohibited from seeing some of these.
And probably still should be. And let's look at the 1971-72 television season. Archie Bunker leading the way, and Gunsmoke nearing the end of its historic run. And the ABC movie of the week was in there too. So maybe that puts us in the frame of mind to remember sort of where we all were in 1971.
When you showed me that list, I couldn't believe that Gunsmoke was still running in 71, 72.
Until recently, it was the longest running, until overtaken by one of the Law and Order franchise.
Yeah.
I think it was the longest running drama in
Yeah.
television history. So we would like to invite some participation too from our friends who are with us tonight, using the Q&A mechanism at the bottom as opposed to the chat. We'd rather keep it in the Q&A, a little easier to keep track of, but whatever works for you. And we're going to throw out a couple of questions and ask you just to pop in some answers so we can ask Richard to reflect on some of the people, places, and things that you may bring up with us. And let's start with this. Who was the most influential person in your life at PC? It could be a professor, a friend, a chaplain, staff member, whoever it might be. How about if we toss that question your way, Richard? Long association. Can you pick out a person in particular that really has had a major influence on you?
I can. And I thought long and hard about this, and I decided that it was Fabe Cunningham. I met him, almost as soon as I arrived at the college, because I was an organist at that time. And I offered to play for masses if he needed an accompaniment, because there was a little choir for the chapel in Aquinas Hall. And so he said, okay, see you Sunday morning, 11 o'clock. So I showed up a few minutes early and I said, where's the music? He said, what music? Fake it. So that was my first encounter with him, but we became good friends over the years. And because he directed 2 years of the honors colloquium that I was in, I think he had the most influence on me in my college time.
If one were to pose that question to Father Shanley, they would get the same answer. Interestingly, Father Shanley points to Father Cunningham as,
is that right?
perhaps the most significant piece of many PC influences.
Yeah.
So Don has replied, recommending that we mention one of your longtime colleagues, Richard Daisy.
Richard Deasy, yeah. He was a very kind man, and I'm not surprised that a student would respond that way.
And Bridget indicates that the primary influence on her would be Father Guido, Father Joe
Yeah,
Guido, who is
yeah.
with the college right now, a psychology faculty member and a practitioner in the student support services area. So
I can understand
great
why
connection.
those two responses would come up, because they're both very gentle men.
Lots of similarities, aren't there? That's an
Yeah.
interesting point. So thanks to Don and to Bridget for participating there. Rich, let's talk first more specifically about the arrival of women, as Heidi had described just a couple of minutes ago. Tell us more about the national context, what was going on with respect especially to Catholic colleges.
Well, it, it was a turbulent time in the country. There was a lot of student rebellion for various reasons. Rules breaking was one of the favorite games of the day, because so many students were rejecting traditional political authority, rejecting parental authority, and even at the college, they were restive under parietal systems of residential life, and so that was one consideration. The other thing that was so important at an all-male college like Providence College was the Vietnam War, because of the expectation of graduating and then being drafted, and 6 months after graduation, finding themselves, if not in combat, at least in another part of the world with the possibilities of combat ahead of them. And so it was in some ways a worrisome time. When we look at some of the music, we might think, well, this was a pretty jolly time, but actually it wasn't. About 3 months ago, our late cherished friend, Charlie Joyce, called me to ask about the atmosphere of the campus at the time that women arrived. And we had a long conversation, in the course of which I said to Charlie that the atmosphere on campus was heavy. And it was, to a great extent, for the two reasons that I've just mentioned to you, the kind of student and late teen, early 20 rebelliousness, and the effects of the Vietnam War. And the arrival of women just had a really refreshing effect on the campus, so that the atmosphere brightened. I can't think of any other way to say it than to say that the atmosphere brightened.
What were your thoughts as the college was moving toward becoming co-ed? How did you perceive the changes that were occurring in the institution?
Well, the survey that was conducted by the Faculty Senate of all the faculty 2 years before the women arrived was whether the college should make a decision to go co-ed, or whether it would be better to remain an all-male college. And when the Faculty Senate reported the results of that, they printed every response. And I was surprised to see that my response was the first one on the list. And I had said, do it, whether it's financially necessary or not. It's going to be good for the college. And that was the general disposition. There were a few people on campus who were afraid of losing the character of the place as it had existed for more than 50 years. But I think that didn't persist as a resistance.
The idea that the class of 1975 was the first class of women is not precisely true. Can you tell us a little bit more about where women were within the college, within the academic community before the fall of 1971?
There were women transfer students who came in 1971. And so not every young woman arriving on campus was a freshman. There were some sophomores and juniors. So in the class of 73 and 74, there were women graduating. And even prior to that, School of Continuing Education had women students, and there was a School of Theology for religious women, for sisters, and that had existed for probably 20 years, I think, before the first class of coeducational college.
It's worth pointing out that a group of Dominican sisters will be at PC this summer. So
Yes,
that continues, obviously,
right.
is something
Yeah.
very important. Could you go back to something that you addressed a moment ago, Richard? Could you tell us a little bit more about the role of the faculty in planning for, we'll address both of the major things that happened in 1971, the arrival of women and DWC. But first of all, with respect to the turn to coeducational status.
I suppose I have general impressions of the faculty at large, but mostly I can represent, I think, the faculty that I was in closest association with, and virtually all of them were looking forward to it. And I remember that summer with the Western Civilization team that I was going to be teaching on, in anticipation of the arrival of new class, of men and women, we were pretty excited about what was ahead. I'll say more about that when we start talking about Western civilization, because there were so many things that were new that were happening. I should maybe say to our audience that although we're going to be talking a lot about the fall of 1971, there are other questions about the history of the college that are fair game to ask. If I can answer them, I will. If not, I'll give them to Joe to answer.
If you can't, no one can. So
I don't know about that. There's some pretty good memories still around among the white-haired people. We can talk about the new curriculum. We can talk about the Slavin Center. We can talk about the new president. We can talk about the new landscape of the campus, new athletic directors, male and female, student Bill of Rights that fall. There are so many things that were happening that fall that we could go all night talking about the fall of 71, but we don't have to. We can take other questions.
I had the opportunity to have a phone conversation a couple of weeks ago with Dr. Haas, who was as Father Haas was president of the college during the period where most of the planning for the events of 1971 took place. And then the college had a presidential transition when Father Peterson came in. Can you tell us a little more about that change and really address Father Haas's role, if you would, with respect to building this plan?
I was on the first Western Civ team, 8:30 in the morning, the first day of Civ with now I call him Bill Haas and Rodney De La Santa and Father Tom Fallon. And it was a little bit odd to be in a give and take relationship, planning this with a man who had just been the president of the college and was only a couple of months away from that. But Bill Haas was and still is, I'm in contact with him occasionally, a very amiable guy. And so the conversations were really easy. He was open-minded, I would say. He was a philosopher who was more than simply a teacher. He was a thinker in philosophical mode. And I would say it was really a pleasure working with him. As president, I know that he was not traditional in every respect. The Centennial booklet makes a mistake in putting him at the corner of Eaton and River on that famous occasion when Vietnam protesters blocked the street. That wasn't Haas, it was another priest. And he was in fact upset about what happened on that occasion. As president, he was pretty even-tempered, I would say. And he had a good touch with students. My friend, Dr. Nunzio, likes to tell a story about one occasion in which students came in with some protest issue, marched into Father Haas's office and asked, for their demands to be met. They said, "Okay, let's talk about what you want." And he said, "Let's go down to Hawkins Auditorium so we can have, you can sit down and we can talk about this." Well, he led them down there. They had that conversation. It was all over. They left cheering him. So that's the sort of influence that the man could have.
Well, that's good leadership, isn't it? So he's in his 90s now, and one of only two living former presidents, along with Father Shanley. So
That's right. Yes.
it's
Yeah.
nice to have him in touch with the college.
Yeah.
Wow. What a time for Father Peterson to take over as president with all this momentous change occurring.
Right. Yes. Well, the lay of the land wasn't new to him. He had been dean of the college for several years, and so he had a good sense of the academic atmosphere, and he was party to the introduction of a new curriculum, and so he was sympathetic with that and supportive of that, and so his introduction, I would say, in 1971 was pretty smooth. He was, of course, as most alums know, the president of the college when the fire in Aquinas occurred in 1977. And after, when the college resumed functioning in January of 1978, he moved into Aquinas Hall. And he was, and he stayed there as a sort of father figure. And so Father Peterson became a kind of beloved leader for the people who needed a lot of healing from the aftermath of the fire.
Before we turn to discussion of development of Western civilization and our program, when you think of the planning for the arrival of women, what were some of the considerations, logistics and other things that we may not think about today? What kinds of things had to be figured out and managed?
Well, residence was one big thing because Aquinas Hall had to be taken out of circulation for the preceding year. And so there were refurbishings made of Aquinas, not so massive that it cost tons of money, but the building had to be refitted, let's say, to accommodate women students. And one of the other considerations, and in looking through the cowl for that fall, I found this issue coming up. The college had a kind of extra protective disposition toward the women students, more so than toward the men students, and that meant kind of restrictive. And so visitation issues, questions about when the window shades had to be pulled down in the evening, well, all sorts of things that weren't quite clear, at least from what I read in the cowl by women students addressing this. They were confused about exactly what restrictions they had to abide by, which doors they could leave the dorm by, and things like the window shades. Of course, that harkens back to a situation in the 1950s when the college acquired Stephen Hall, and there were men living in Aquinas at that time, and Stephen Hall had been the House of the Good Shepherd, which was a residence for unmarried young women who were pregnant. And notices were put up in Aquinas that men should be careful about walking around in their shorts, and they should be careful about pulling their shades, because apparently some of the young women in Stephen Hall were noticing.
I think it's not quite fascinating, very interesting that you taught the very first day of Western Civ at the earliest hour. I just love that. I think that's so fitting. And talk about an all-star team. Grace, De La Sata, Haas, and Fallon. My goodness, what a group you were with there.
We had a good time, but we learned a lot of things that we hadn't anticipated. We had an idea of what we wanted to do in this launching of the new curriculum. Every team was going to be different. It's like any situation in which you have general degree requirements taught by different professors. And our team was going to be different from the team that took our classroom at 10:30, let's say. But the part of the thinking behind the establishment of Western civilization and the removal of so many requirements in the previous curriculum was to link together subjects that used to be taught separately. Prior to 1971, the old curriculum required 18 hours of philosophy and 18 hours of theology and 6 hours of English and 6 hours of history. So at that point, we're up to 48 hours. And this was to be replaced by a 20-hour program combining philosophy and theology and history and literature. And the point of it all was to see the connections that, Aristotle wasn't talking to himself in an atmosphere that was void of exchanges or political factors and so forth. And so that was the intention there. And we were enthusiastic about making that happen, but we had things to learn. And one is that we shouldn't lecture to one another, but to the students. And it took us a little while to learn that. And one of the most dramatic instances of that occurred in the very first week of Western Civilization team, when my colleague Father Fallon was talking about Persian religion prior to the Greco-Roman world. And he started talking about the concept of angels in Persian religion. And a young woman sitting right in the first row fainted, just clumped right down on the floor. And I don't think it was that hot a day. I think she was just overwhelmed by what was going on. And we learned that we had to start teaching the students rather than trying to teach one another. And we also learned that we couldn't assign as much as we were ambitious to assign them. I recall one week at the end of September or the beginning of October when we had them read the Iliad for, I think, Thursday's class, and we had assigned the Odyssey in its entirety for Monday's class. So that gives you, 4 days in which you have to read these two huge epics. And not only were the students laboring, we were laboring at that point in time. So we had to curb our ambitions a little bit. So the first year was really learning to fly by the seat of our pants. We had a plan, and we had to see how it was going to work and what we could do to make the students excited about it. And we tried very hard to make the students excited about it. I don't know whether there are any members of the class of 75 out there now who are pushing pins in a Grace voodoo doll and remembering what it was like, but it was exciting.
Let's use the Q&A window again and invite people to tell us who some of their Western Civ professors were. Bonus points if you can remember an entire team of 4 all together. That would be pretty good. What was let's say the summer before the beginning of that term like, Richard, with respect to the teams? How did you? This is new. Teaching with 3 other people 5 days a week through the whole year. So it would seem like there had to be an extensive amount of planning.
There was. We met numerous times, and our team meetings were really good experiences because we liked one another. And in fact, one of the things that was new that fall, maybe we can talk about it subsequently, was the pub on campus. There was a Rathskeller in the Slavin Center, and we would have our team meetings there, and we'd get a pitcher of beer and talk about the Aeneid and what we intended to do with Roman history and things of that sort. And it was work, but it was really pleasant work.
Also in consideration of the sort of run up to this beginning of this ambitious program, was there a thing or a combination of things what motivated the creation of development of Western Civ?
Paul Thompson had been an undergraduate at Columbia back in the 1930s. For those of you watching who don't recognize that name, Paul Thompson retired as a Catholic priest after having been the academic vice president for 15, 17 years, something on that order. And before that, being a professor of English and the first director of the honors program. And before all of that, he was an Episcopal priest. He was a convert to Catholicism and was ordained fairly late in life. So, and along the way, he was a Marine Corps chaplain in World War II. And he had really wonderful stories to tell about his experiences in the South Pacific during World War II. But to get back to his student days at Columbia in the 1930s, the Columbia curriculum had a great books program. And that was the model for the colloquium in world civilization that the honors program adopted right at the outset. And well, it began in 1959. The program began in 57. The juniors began with that colloquium in 59. And so it was essentially an importing of the Columbia Great Books program. But as the chair of the curriculum revision committee, he and other people like Rennie Fortin had the idea that we could combine the various parts of the general degree requirements and make them work together. So the origin is his experience at Columbia, but the spin on it to make it distinctive and really unique to PC was something that he presided over the creation of.
Getting a mention of a few of your colleagues in the Q&A, Richard. Don has mentioned Professor McGovern and Professor Reed, Bridget, Professor Graver, Professor Lawless, Professor Holland, Karen Holland, also a PC alum, Professor Keating, Professor Delasata, Vance Morgan, Professor Morgan. So lots of names you know well.
And the first question I know is coming from Joe Zielinski, and he's talking about Father Dan Riley, and I have a really warm feeling for Father Dan Riley, even though he seemed as though he was mad at us every day he came to class. I learned a whole lot from him, and you know, outside of class, found him to be a very caring man. But he taught in a unique way. It was as if one was getting I don't know, a crazy quilt assembled in the course of the year. But when I got to graduate school, I found that I knew more about historiography than many of my peers in graduate school. It was because of the 4 semesters that I had with Dan Riley. So Joe is asking how the atmosphere of thinking of the students as clods and telling them to get out of Pawtucket, which Dan Riley did regularly, how that changed beginning in 71. Well, I think no one dared to tell the young women to get out of Pawtucket or refer to them as clods. A lot of things changed in the fall of 71.
And Jim, who's with us tonight, had the great good fortune of having Father Thompson, and Jim has referred to him as Father Van Thompson, Paul Van K. Thompson.
Van K.
Right. So really interesting. And as
yes, there was a German part to him, that's Van Kuykendall, and a Scottish part, that's Thompson.
Put it all together and you have a very influential intellectual within the context and the history of Providence College, for sure. For the benefit, Richard, of those with us tonight who may have been students toward the earlier part of DWC, could you describe how it's different now? It's fewer credit hours and the seminar piece is in there. Would you go through that for us?
Right. The curriculum was changed in 2010 to take effect with freshman class 2 years later, I believe it was. And Western civilization was reduced from 20 credits to 16 credits, still 4 semesters, 3 semesters of narrative development, and the 4th semester as a colloquium dealing with all sorts of topics. The teams, two-member teams for the fourth semester colloquia may come from chemistry and health policy, or they might come from Spanish and I don't know, theology. And so the makeup of the teams for that fourth semester is quite varied. So students meet, instead of meeting 5 days a week, they meet 2 days a week now, 2 hours at a stretch. The old system was to meet 5 days a week, 4 lectures and 1 discussion class, or as we somewhat fancifully called it, a seminar. That was one of the things we had to learn, was how to make the seminar work. And you know, if you think of a seminar as a conversation with a group of people, you might think of conversation as being spontaneous. And one of the things that we had to learn was that the seminars weren't always going to be spontaneous, that you really had to have a plan going in, that you wanted, you had certain outcomes in mind, not imposing ideas, but outcomes in terms of certain questions being addressed in the course of the hour. And so that was one of the big challenges to teaching Civ.
Was it uncomfortable to wear that gigantic microphone around your neck? Well,
Well,
I
not
could,
generally.
could still picture those. I can.
Yes, you had to clip it on your belt. I don't know how many belts I ruined by clipping that thing on my belt. And you had the microphone, you know, up near your tie. And the scary thing about it was that you might forget to shut it off. Like the day one professor went into the men's room and forgot to shut off his microphone, you know, or conversations in between class hours in which you forgot to shut the mic off, and you'd like to play back some of the things that were said.
You're memorialized forever on the reel-to-reel tapes in Phillips Memorial Library, right?
Yes,
It never goes away.
yeah. Accommodations, if we can talk about buildings in 71, accommodations were sort of bare bones to begin with. Western Civ was taught on the 3rd floor of Harkins. And it was a while before we moved. Well, I think by the 2nd semester, we had moved into Aquinas, into where the old dining hall had been on the 1st floor of Aquinas. And then it was about 1988 or 1990, somewhere around there, when the whole program moved into Moore Hall and took over that building. But the first accommodations were sort of makeshift, and we had to make do with a room for 100, which meant in most cases knocking down a wall so that a classroom that could have accommodated 50 became, I won't say suitable, but could fit 100 people jammed in there. So that was one of the physical accommodations. But Slavin Center was a whole new accommodation for students. PC had never had a student union. Alumni Hall, which was modified with the addition of the Slavin Center, used to have a cafeteria. In fact, the cafeteria is still down there below ground level, but there was a lawn that stretched from the entrance to the alumni cafeteria up to where the parking lot was between Harkins and Alumni. And it was kind of a beautiful atmosphere for the cafeteria because you had this sea of green in front of you, and that was lost. But it was a good trade-off because Slavin gave the college a student union, which it had never had before, and so there could be places for student organizations to meet, a multi-function hall where there could be dances or there could be lectures, that sort of thing. And so it was a much needed addition to the campus.
Still central to so much that goes on day to day, especially
It is right,
the
with
student
the
population.
atrium added to it. Many people may not know that the atrium is a part of a renovation of Slavin that occurred in response to student requests for additional activity space and study space. So that addition to Slavin involves a lounge downstairs where activity, there's a televisions in the lounge now, and a quiet lounge upstairs where students can study, and an atrium with tables where they can get coffee and come up and sit there and read. So that was, and to a great extent, a student-generated change in the building. But one of the things about Slavin, to get back to the Rathskeller that I mentioned earlier, is that there had never been a bar on campus. You know, what happened with student drinking in those years is that guys would sneak down past the powerhouse to Admiral Street and have their beers at Bradley's, and then sneak back up to the campus after hours sometimes. And Father Murphy was the dean of men in the 1960s, would hide in the cemetery, and he would catch them coming back. And he told me once that a student said to him, "Now, come on, Father, weren't you young once?" And he said, "I don't think so." And he would write out these wonderful satirical penalties that got posted in public in the dorms. It was like, I don't know, notices that were put up on bulletin boards in the 18th century, and that's the way the punishments that would be doled out. So I got away from the subject and into the Bradley's theme here, but the Rathskeller gave students who were 21, it had a Club 21 license, and students who were 21 could drink there. And it had the good function of keeping them from wandering to some of the less desirable water holes in the neighborhood.
And not too many years later, the drinking age was down to 18. And so the
Yes,
18-year-old students.
the drinking age went down to 18, and in 1980, it went back up to 19, and then I think it was 82, it went up to 20, and by 1985, it was back up to 21 again. And so the McPhail's drinking establishment in the Slavin Center now is almost on the site of the Rathskeller. Not quite, but almost on the site of the Rathskeller.
This is indicative of your sophistication, Richard. You keep referring to it as the Rathskeller, where many of us would call it the Rat.
The Rat, yes.
The more common name for it.
Yes. Yeah.
Don, who seems to be of my vintage more or less, says his memory may be failing, but in the late 1970s, he doesn't recall if the team taught together each day. He thinks that some sessions were presented solo by one professor. That tracks with my recollection. I think it was mostly one professor at a time in DWC.
Yes, the others would be present. If you remember, they would be sitting somewhere, and once in a while we'd call on one another, or if we had a challenging question, we might present it to the person giving the lecture. I remember one day when we were teaching in Aquinas Hall, in the old dining room in Aquinas, and there's a walk that goes along the west side of that room, and I think it was Father Fallon and Father Kiu had gotten into a kind of disputation, a Thomistic style disputation about some philosophical question. And my late colleague Paul Trainer was walking by, and I could see him. I was sitting facing the other two professors, and I could see him stop at the window, and he was obviously engaged by what was going on. And about 1 minute later, he popped through the door, and he was in the disputation. I thought, well, this is a pretty good example for the students about how faculty can get worked up about things that probably aren't going to change the world.
Dr. Trainer was part of my first year DWC team. You were my sophomore year, but Dr. Trainer, Dr. Curran, Father Heyman, and Father Garzillo. So lots of good memories with those wonderful professors for sure. I was very lucky in many ways. You probably were not thinking much about 50 years forward in these days, but if you can kind of reconstruct this, would you say that the progress over this, or rather the changes that came about in 1971 caused things that have exceeded your expectations with respect to the way the college developed?
In 1971, I don't know that I was thinking that far forward. I was, probably thinking to the next year. And what team I would be on, whether our team would be staying together, and inviting a new class of students into the honors program, things like that. I doubt that I was thinking 50 years forward, but if I can look into the rear view mirror, and I think that may be part of the intent of your question, and say where the change is good, was the college moving forward? Of course, I would say the college was moving forward in many ways, socially, with a more normal society, male and female, on the campus, and intellectually. There were a lot of new faculty hired in 1971. I'm thinking of Jane Lunan Perel, who came on board in 1971. I think that Alice Beckwith, who would have been known as Alice Hauk back in those years, came on board. I think Jim Baker in the art department joined the regular faculty that year. There were a lot of new hires, and there were people who stayed for a long time and were very valuable in the faculty. So the college has generally moved forward. Are there a couple of things that I would like to say maybe we could have reconsidered, but I just want to talk about happy things tonight. I don't want to look back at anything that has a negative cast to it at this point.
Well, few things are perfect in such a complex organization, right?
Right. Yes. Sure. Yeah. Oh, you see more of it than I do these days.
Speaking of Jane Lunan Perel, and to draw our attention back to the magazine that Heidi was kind enough to mention at the beginning of the program tonight, the current issue of Providence College magazine, Jane Lunan Perel is one of 7 people who contributed
Yes.
writing to it, 7 alumni women. So
Right.
it's a very nice element of that piece. And I will put the link to the website in the Q&A here in just a minute, so that people can look at it that way. But hopefully you've all received it in the mail by now.
I think that my copy was chewed up by a postal machine. So I've been reading little bits of it online. And just today, I read The Last Word from Anne Manchester Molac. And if you're listening out there, Anne, I want you to know that that very subtle reference you made to the Western Civ faculty at the beginning was right on the money, because we were learning to fly by the seat of our pants.
We'll send you 2, Richard. I'm very sorry that it hasn't made it to you yet in the mail, but we'll certainly recover, and
I'll enjoy it when I get my hands on it.
we'll deliver them to you in Swansea if it comes to that.
I wanted to say one more thing about the Slavin Center, and maybe some students will remember that there was a statue on the lawn out in front of the Slavin Center, which the students referred to as Mr. and Mrs. Slavin. Actually, whether students actually believe that or not, I don't know. But the name of that statue was Truth is Eternally Young. And it showed a young man and a young woman walking, not as a romantic couple, but a young man and a young woman walking arm in arm. And they're dressed in a sort of the clothing they're wearing is timeless. It doesn't fit into medieval times or early modern times or the 20th century. And so the statue actually fits its name, that truth is eternally young, because there is a time-free quality about the statue. Well, about maybe 15 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, the statue was moved. And so students tend not to see it these days. In recent years, when I've taken a Dimensions of Art class to look at sculpture on campus, and I've pointed this out to them, they've said, we never noticed it. We don't pay any attention to it because it's kind of dwarfed by a tree at the moment. And so I'd vote for moving it somewhere else.
We just had a statue of St. Dominic moved on campus, right from lower campus down right up now to the area outside of Guzman Hall. So it overlooks the area it used to be.
It's between Dominic Hall and St. Dominic Chapel. Yeah.
Very nice. Looks terrific where it is, and it just proves that they can be moved, I suppose, if it comes to that. For sure. Now, you and I cannot have a conversation without talking a little bit about sports, Richard. And
Right.
women arrived in 1971, and that, of course, began a women's athletics program that has been very successful. And that really began to happen pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yes, it did. In my prowling through the cowl, I found an interview with Helen Burt, who was the first director of women's athletics. And she admitted in that article that she had the daunting task of having to invent a women's athletic program. The first thing she thought about, apparently, was establishing a varsity women's basketball team. But from there, of course, the women's sports expanded in a number of directions, and the one that became most successful was the women's cross-country team. I might mention that in 1971, there was no Title IX. Title IX was an amendment adopted by Congress in 1972 to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it prohibited discrimination by reason of gender. And that eventually was going to result in lawsuits over sports issues at Brown and at Duke, both in the 1990s. So PC wasn't even thinking in terms of gender balancing in 1971 when they began to develop a women's athletic program. But you're right, quite fast. I think by the end of the 80s, the women's hockey team was very competitive. And by the 1990s, of course, the cross-country team was national champion in 1993. And they repeated that in 2015, which is one of the reasons why I say that they are probably the most successful of the women's athletic teams. Nevertheless, there was a kind of a women's hockey dynasty in the late ECAC and then Hockey East at the very beginning of the 21st century. And the women's basketball team won a Hockey East championship. And so there have been, lots of All-Americans and Olympians. The 1998 Nagano hockey team that won the gold medal had 7 PC players on the team. And so you're right. A big change came to PC athletics in 1971.
And under Coach Matt Kelly, the women's hockey team qualified for the NCAA tournament in the most recent season. So back to national prominence, which is
That's right. Yeah.
nice to see for sure.
There's one thing that I'd like to mention about 71, if you will allow me to grab a topic before I switch it back to you, and that's the beanie. Beanies were worn by freshmen for about the first 6 weeks of the fall semester. But that had to be junked when the women arrived in 1971, because I don't think there was anybody who was going to insist that all the women students wear beanies for 6 weeks and then engage in a tug of war with the sophomores to see if they could be liberated from that. The beanie was dropped during World War II, and it wasn't resumed until 1953. And then it lasted for another 18 years before it had to be abandoned. But it was a source of embarrassment to freshmen to have to go to the early mixers wearing their beanies. One student said, I don't mind going to the dining hall, and I don't mind going to class wearing a beanie, but going to a dance with a beanie is altogether too much. And I saw in the cowl for, when was it, the fall of 1970, an advertisement for a dance called the Beanie Bop. And I mean, it just seems so silly, the Beanie Bop. The girls who were coming to those events, those mixes, were being imported from Salve Regina or Albertus Magnus or the nursing schools in Providence. And so the guys had never met these girls before, and the first encounter was wearing this silly thing on their heads. Okay, back to you, Joe. You ask better questions.
Oh, this is great. We just have a few minutes left, Richard, and as usual, the time has gone by so quickly when we have a chance to visit with you. If you have anything you'd like to throw out at Richard, please do put it in the Q&A right away. But I have something, Richard.
Yeah.
One of the things happening on campus this summer is a major renovation to Raymond Hall, the dining facility in Raymond. So that will be fully refurbished for the fall semester. That's been the place where students have eaten for a long time. But
Oh, yeah.
give us a tour of the dining facilities over time, and what have been some of the features and maybe some of the challenges.
Well, of late, the popularity of food trucks has affected the college. And for many years, there was a food truck, a single food truck that used to park on Huxley Avenue. It was not, do you remember the silver
Oh,
truck?
the silver truck. Yes.
That was a pretty popular place for people for their evening snacks. But when I first arrived at the college, the dining hall was on the main floor of Aquinas Hall. It was a long, a long room, ran for half the length of the building, and the kitchen and serving facilities were at the far north end of that floor. And the waiters would come, we had waiters serve the tables, and they were 12 at a table. So it was like something out of King Arthur, although some days the guys their manners were as crude as I suspect the medieval knights at Camelot were. I remember one day when we would get French bread cut up into small pieces, and a whole basket of that would be put on the table. Well, one day at lunch, someone picked up a piece of French bread and threw it at a friend. And the friend responded with a piece of French bread, and one table after another joined in the fray, so that eventually the air was filled with French bread. Well, okay, eventually there was no French bread left. The next resort was to throw a cup. And these cups were made out of some plastic compound. You could probably buy 1,000 of them for $10. And a cup went through the air, then another cup, and eventually everything, all the place settings were flying through the air, but you couldn't see anybody because everybody was underneath the tables. That was known as the healthy all-male atmosphere. I don't think anything like that happened. I don't know whether there were food fights when the women arrived in 1971, but the Raymond Dining Hall opened in the fall of 1963, and it's been expanded a couple of times since then as the population of the college grew. I'm going to take advantage of your offer to mention one thing, and I want to read a portion of the Centennial book. It's very short. With alumni. When I was writing this essay,
Richard?
Yes.
Can you turn toward, we're losing you a little bit. Maybe
Okay,
can you
all
turn
right.
toward your microphone a bit?
I'll move the book in front of me. Can you hear
Perfect.
me okay now?
That's much better.
Okay now. There were 55,000 alumni back in 2017. So add probably another 4,000 to that. And I said this in the essay, they are in many respects the living history of Providence College, carrying with them not only the education they received, the influence of the Dominicans, the accumulating treasure hoard of stories from their years here, the values that were imbued from their professors, their mentors, their chaplains, their coaches, and their best peers, and an abiding image of a place that will always be sacred to them. I want to go back to one line, that as the living history of Providence College, they carry with them a treasure hoard of stories from their years here. I want to invite all of you who are listening to send in those stories, because if you don't, they're all going into the ground with you eventually. And the same applies to me. I've been trying to collect the stories. So, sit down at the computer for 5 minutes and type out one of the best stories you have and send it to Joe Carr or send it to me, and we'll see that it gets to the right archive.
Here's an easy email address to remember, and I'll just put it here in the chat, and that is Marcom, which is short for Marketing and Communications, which is the area where I work, and I can keep track of them here. So marcom@providence.edu. Forgive me for a second while I type, but that would be great. We would love to have those reflections and to use them to help the ongoing project of compiling the college's history.
Yes.
So
yeah, somebody's going to have to write it at the next stage, 22 more years, one more years down the line or another half century down the line?
Well, the person who does that will have a great advantage that you didn't have, and that is that she or he will be able to read what you wrote at the centennial, because it was
Thank
so
you.
beautiful, setting the context and those thematic essays that really did tell the story of primarily the second half of the first century, but still is just fantastic work. And we're all forever grateful for that immense contribution to the college's history and really its character in many ways. So
You know,
once again, thank you for that.
my beloved friend Rodney De La Santa used to say among the group of us when we had reached our 60s that we were approaching our anecdotage. And I hope that I haven't bored people with too much anecdotage tonight. You have a lot of good stories out there. Send them in.
Love to hear them. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And Richard, again, thanks so much for your time and all the creative energy you put into preparing for these events and for guiding us through these recollections, which are so important for us to hear. At the college, we're all very excited about beginning this celebration of the 50th anniversary of the arrival of women in the class of 1971. It's going to be a long 15 months or so period of great celebrations, and we hope you'll be able to join us over and over again for them. And at the same time, this weekend to celebrate the 50th reunion of the wonderful class of 1971, which features so many notable Friar alumni. So we're at a great juncture here, and it's very exciting. Thanks again, Richard. Thank you all. Good night.
I know.